Alex. I'm a psychologist. I see a lot of familiar faces in here, so thank you for coming. I have the really great privilege and fortune to work with Oakhill in a lot of different capacities. Lots of times it's individually with students and families, but sometimes it's with teachers and doing some didactic work and just supporting the school climate overall. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about something that comes up all the time in my own private practice. I ask about it. If you've worked with me, you know I ask about this a lot in screen time in your kids. And so we're going to talk about a lot of different things today. I have probably about 40, 45 minutes, not 90 minutes. And so after that, feel free to leave, ask me questions. I'll stay around just for a little bit afterwards. If you want to ask some individual questions, that's fine too. All right, so I have learned a lot about, do a lot of these talks across different disciplines, teachers, professionals, coaches, parents. I've learned about what I like to do in these talks, what's important. I've also been in you guys' shoes. I go to a lot of these talks and I've learned a lot about what I hate hearing about. So I'm going to try to make this engaging for you guys. And also it's about 40, 45 minutes because that's really all I can focus on too myself. So I'm going to run through just a little bit about who I am, what I do here, kind of how I'm oriented to this type of work. And then I'm going to ask you guys as parents and caregivers and teachers to reflect for a second on some of these challenges you guys are seeing in your kids and students. We're going to talk about how kids' brains develop, give you a bit of a crash course on that, talk about executive functioning skills, what those mean. And then we're going to talk about what the science really says about screen time use. So this is something that comes up all the time. I get three really big questions. How much is too much? Is all screen time created equal? The answer is no. We'll talk about that. The third one is, how do we get our kids unstuck from screens? Okay, constant three questions in my practice. And then I'm going to give you some practical strategies and some key takeaways and questions. This is where I've been, what I do. Really in Kansas City, my capacity is in private work. So if you've worked with me, you know that I do more in-depth psychoeducational and psychological testing, really making clear recommendations about how to support kids in their learning. I work with young kids, and I also do quite a bit of work with older learners too. Students in graduate school, medical school, taking the bar exam, and they need help because of a learning disability, things like that. The work that I do with older students really starts at this level, okay? So it starts with elementary school kids, getting kids the right accommodations. The other half of my work is collaborating with people who are non-mental health professionals, like Cure. I want to talk with you guys. I want to use the knowledge we have and distill it down so it's understandable. Some of the things that I'll talk about today are things that you can go home and do tonight if you feel so inclined, some practical strategies. So we're going to focus on that. Some self-reflection stuff first. A lot of people in my practice come in and say, my kid, I asked them to do three things and they do one of them and kind of only one of them halfway and forget the second and third. How many of you are also in kind of like this kind of mafia negotiation at home of like 5 more minutes, and then it's like an hour, your kid's still on the screen, you're upset, you feel like a failure. All of that happens all the time, hear about it all the time. Told your kid to get off your device while you're holding your own phone, okay? Something that we're going to talk about today is the messaging that you guys send as adults to your kids about how do you engage with digital input. Okay, we're going to hear me talk about that this whole time. And also, what I just said, messaging about technology. Do you use it as a parent when you're stressed? Do you use it to fulfill boredom? Do you use it to try to relax? And your kid is soaking up some of that. And so the messaging that we're sending to our kids about our own engagement with screen time is important. Okay, let's do a little bit of a crash course on the developing brain. I'm going to talk to you about some things we call the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala. We're going to talk about two processes that are called myelination and pruning. We're going to talk about dopamine, this amazing chemical. And of course, what's this all mean for my kid? All right, so there is a lot of organization that's happening in your kids' brains, particularly during sensitive periods. We're going to talk about that in a sec. We think evolutionarily, the brain developed from the back of our head to the front. And so that's why you have central things housed in the back of the brain that connect the brain to your brainstem and the spinal cord, things that we call the limbic system. So have you ever thought about why you don't actually really need to consciously think about inhaling and exhaling every time you take a breath? Those are automated functions near the back of the brain. This part of the brain is online super, super early, okay? So housed in the back of the brain are things like survival mechanisms, primal emotions, fear, anger, things like that, automatic responses. The front of the brain, the last thing, evolutionarily speaking, to develop are things that are about reasoning and planning and 40,000 years ago, we weren't really that concerned about what's going to happen tomorrow because we were just focused on what's going to happen right now, staying alive. And that's why when you see people who are in automobile accidents, you see people with concussions, they hit the front of their head on the dashboard, their behavior and emotions are really erratic because that's where those processes are housed in the brain. Now, the crux here is that the upper brain, your prefrontal cortex, we're going to talk more about, is online drastically later for your kids. And so I often use this term in my practice when I'm working with young kids, that emotion first, logic later. So your feeling brain takes over, the thinking brain is totally offline. And that's really why it's completely unhelpful to try to logic and reason with your young kids when they're upset. It makes no difference to them. Their brain's flooded. That part of their brain is totally offline. So don't even try to reason with them. It's not going to happen. All right, so prefrontal cortex is kind of like the CEO in training. Some people call this the city planner. Really right behind our forehead, it's our command center, houses things like focus, planning, decision-making, self-regulation, and also these fancy things that we're going to talk more about, executive functions, things like organizing and managing our time, focusing and shifting our attention, inhibiting our impulses, not acting really on all our impulses right away, emotion regulation. This is one thing that we don't talk too much about as mental health professionals. A lot of people think executive functions are just inhibiting impulses and focusing. There is a big, big component to managing emotions that come with executive functioning challenges. We're going to talk more about that. And longer term things like goal-directed behavior and being cool without being gratified or reinforced right in the moment. Okay, so we expect this in older kids, hopefully. Now, the catch here is that our prefrontal cortex is developing super, super slowly. Starts around age 4, ends at around 25, 26. So what's this mean? Your young kids, especially kids 4 to 6 to 8, are really, really reliant on emotional and reward systems, reinforcement, right? Structural supports. You have tweens and older teens that are much more interested in things like social feedback or peer approval or the novelty of certain situations. What deactivates or makes it really hard for our kids and adults, really, but especially our kids, to access all the great executive functioning skills that are housed in the front of the brain? A couple key things: stress, fatigue, overstimulation, whether that's sensory or social, or poor sleep. We're going to talk about poor sleep towards the end of our time today, but even these things at low levels take our prefrontal cortex offline, make us look really impulsive, make us look really distracted. That's why when your child is hangry or they're sleepy, right, they act completely different than you expect them to because this part of their brain is totally, totally offline. Okay, so rewiring and wiring, you're going to hear me talk about things like myelination and pruning, fancy neuropsych terms. Now, synaptic pruning means that we're trimming unused connections in the brain, but strengthening the ones that we use a lot. There's a couple key things here. If you don't remember anything that I say today, remember that the brain gets really, really good at what it practices repeatedly, okay? The other half of that, the double-edged sword to that, is the brain is not discerning in the least bit about what's good things for us to practice and what isn't good things for us to practice. This is obviously the basis for how habits form. And then the whole other end of the continuum is this is how addiction occurs. So there's a lot of things happening here. Pruning means that if I'm not using this behavior or this thought process, the brain's going to get rid of that because it seems that it's not used. Okay, so I don't really need that. But I'm going to strengthen the ones that I use a lot. The second half of this is what we call myelination. So the pathways, the behaviors, the thought processes that are used a lot, the brain starts to insulate those because it says these are really important for my brain here. They're being used a lot, so I need to make sure that they're getting insulated and they're even stronger and it becomes faster and more efficient. So whatever your kids repeatedly do, whether that's focusing real hard, whether that's learning to love to read, moving around, scrolling on a phone, autoplay videos, right? Those things become hardwired in. The repetition, the opportunities for repetition we give our kids really, really matter. And the brain is not very discerning about what's good for me and what's not good for me. So we have these periods too that we call sensitive periods in developmental psychology where the brain is especially receptive to certain types of development. So when very, very early kids, like 1 to 4-ish, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about attachment, right? Attachment is really critical during that period. Kids need to learn that adults are trustworthy, particularly a few select adults who they can go to, right? Adolescence, things become a lot more salient around making good decisions, weighing risk and rewards. We know about sensitive periods from research like in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, like single case studies from kids who had really, really kind of terrible things happen to them, neglect, right, not being spoken to. And we know that if you're not spoken to, for an example of a sensitive period, if we don't speak to kids from birth to 10 consistently, they're never going to learn to speak because they've lost that period of their brain. So not to say that when we talk about sensitive periods for executive functioning, which we will, that if you have a 13-year-old and you see, oh man, the sensitive period for executive functioning is 12, like my kid missed the boat, that's not true either. But we do want to make sure that we're instilling these types of skills and abilities in our kids, help building healthy, good habits as early as we can. All right, give me the dopamine, important chemical, okay? So it's not just the pleasure chemical, guys, it's a motivational chemical too. What I mean by that is when you look at the research on dopamine, dopamine actually spikes more during anticipation of an event rather than actually getting a reward, okay? So an example of that would be, personally for me, I'm craving a hamburger or something, right? I have more dopamine rushing in my brain during the craving of this burger than I do actually when I'm eating the burger, okay? So that's important for a number of reasons. Specifically, we talked about addiction. So dopamine is not really the enemy, just like anxiety. Low and balanced levels are really good. We want our kids to have dopamine. We also want our kids to be a little bit anxious. That's important because anxiety helps us drive interest, spawns creativity, helps us be curious, right? Dopamine does the exact same thing. Now, the crux here is that your kids are getting dopamine hits a lot with screen time, okay? So every notification, every level up, every autoplay video, every like, right, is this kind of subtle dopamine hit. That's why social media, these games are so addicting for our kids. Now, I hear this constantly in my practice where I take away the screen from my kid and they throw a massive fit, okay? I'm not here to completely absolve your kid of responsibility for that poor behavior, but I am here to tell you that what we see is a dopamine dip in those moments. The brain is literally recalibrating from this constant stream of dopamine all the time, and you take it away, and their brain all of a sudden has nothing, and that causes some really erratic behavior. So all the more reason why we're going to talk about some practical strategies in a second about how to really take away that device from your kid in a meaningful way rather than just snatch it and expect them to be cool with it. We can't do that. All right, we're going to revisit this in a sec. When you look in the research about dopamine, you have these processes called slow dopamine and fast dopamine. We want for our kids to try to reduce fast dopamine opportunities, okay? Fast dopamine is leveling up, screen times, right? Slow dopamine is things that require delayed gratification. I problem solve with a friend about that argument. I'm engaging in sports and I played a team sport and we win the game. Creative arts, things like that, coding, things that require sustained attention. Fast dopamine activities are not good for our kids. All right, let's pivot to executive functioning. I initially gave this talk during the air traffic control strike, and so that was kind of interesting. But this really is our ATC system, and it manages how we kind of monitor incoming and outgoing information. So when I think about executive functions, I think really in three big buckets. The first one is cognitive, holding attention, shifting attention, using immediate memory, planning ahead, managing our time, shifting gears when plans change. If you've worked with me independently, you know I ask quite a bit about how flexible is your child? Are they kind of go with the flow? Do they kind of double down when you say we're not going to do that? Flexibility is enormously protective for our kids. We want to have flexible kids. The other second box is emotion regulation, how well our kids tolerate frustration, how well they manage their own big emotions, how quickly they bounce back from setbacks, critical executive function. Behavioral regulation, inhibiting impulses, understanding how our behavior impacts others. It's about at this time when I start talking about these things that I get some kind of faces from parents in the crowd of like, all right, this is a problem for our home, right? Like my child is struggling in one of these areas. We're going to talk about that, what that means. In daily life, these things often look like difficulties following directions or focusing, problems switching or transitioning between tasks, managing emotions, right? Lots of times, if your kid is not here quite yet or doesn't have kind of this growing skill set here, it doesn't necessarily mean that their brain is different. Could mean that. It might just mean though that they're lacking some structure and skill building opportunities. So when you're missing these things, you have kind of a really kind of an emotionally volatile kid, a really inflexible kid. You have a kid who's kind of forgetful, kind of a space cadet, right? I say that with all love. So when you're missing these, it really impacts kids' lives. All right, what's the science say behind this? Um, it's critical for academic success, social skills, emotional health. I see a couple different things play out in my practice where I see kids who have really, really strong executive functioning skills. Um, but sometimes they're just not all that bright kids. They're not geniuses, right? They're average, maybe even a little bit below average in their problem solving, but they have great executive functioning skills and it bolsters them up and it makes them look really productive. More often, I see the inverse. I see kids who are actually exceptionally bright, really, really strong problem solvers, lack a lot of these skills, which in some ways that maps onto things like ADHD. In other ways, it's just kids missing the skills, but it doesn't allow them to use all these great abilities they have because they lack the underlying management system to do it, to exercise them. We'll talk more about that. Helping our kids. What do we do? So developing executive functioning skills, particularly in young kids, is really like planting a garden. You have to be nurturing, you have to give positive and some critical feedback and scaffold them. You have to have a lot of routine, you have to have a ton of patience with them, particularly for younger kids. Now, the critical period here is like 5 to 12, but even before then, we can start to instill in our really, really young kiddos some emotional regulation skills and identification. Some of our teenagers, we can still help them build those skills too. It becomes a little more complex. The role of environment here, which environment I mean us as adults, teachers, parents, is that we need to model these things. We need to provide our kids structure and routine and cues of upcoming events in an appropriate way to where they start to internalize and build good habits. It's also modeling things like self-control and praising adaptability. If you've worked with me, um, you hear me talk a lot about reinforcing effort in the process. I'm really not all that interested in how kids are doing like academically. And not that I mean that I don't care about their grades, but I care about the skills that they build to get those grades. That's way more important to me. I want kids to have strong skills to achieve these outcomes. Not all that interested in problem solving necessarily. So what's this look like? Again, if you've worked with me, you know I provide a lot of these recommendations around predictable routines, visual reminders, calendars, to-do lists, consistent expectations, especially for young kids across school, home, extracurriculars. If you're noticing that your kid is getting wildly different messaging from adults in their lives about what is positive or appropriate behavior, probably a really good indicator that maybe you need to have a conversation with the people in their lives about how do we make these consistent expectations across settings more consistent. We want our kids to have the same message. Every time kids use an executive function in real life, the stronger those neural connections become. We talked about myelination. We talked about pruning. Now, I was talking to a few parents before this. My biggest pet peeve as a psychologist is when we don't give our kids opportunities to be bored, okay? If our kid comes to us and says, I'm bored, and then we throw a screen in front of them, we're not allowing them to build the skill of busying themselves. We have to allow kids to be bored. We have to allow them to problem solve about what do I do? I'm sure a lot of us in here grew up in a time where if we went to our parents and said, I'm bored, they would be like, get away from me. Like figure it out, right? I'm not saying that's the right approach either, but we have to give kids opportunities to busy themselves. It's okay for our kids to be bored and figure it out. We shouldn't fill that boredom every chance with a screen. What hijacks, we talked about prefrontal cortex, very similar. What hijacks our executive functions in the moment? Kids who are very anxious, who are very tired, who are very overstimulated. What interferes longer term with executive functioning growth? Chronic stress, chaos in the environment, inconsistent environments, constant distraction, digital overload. We're going to hop right into screens in a second. We want our kids to have positive predictable expectations across settings. Sometimes I field concerns from parents in this way when I offer suggestions about increasing structure and predictability. Parents say, well, how much is too much structure, right? And I think that's an appropriate question. Um, I don't know if I necessarily have an upper limit to the level of structure you can provide your kid. What I can tell you though is when you look at the research on providing kids structure, there's not that many downsides. The brain learns to adapt. Your kids with structure learn that it's okay. Their brains become calmer. They learn that it's okay to problem solve. It's okay to take a breath, right? It's okay to give our kids a lot of structure as long as we're also helping them build skills related to being flexible. And when that structure doesn't exist, that's okay too. Okay, everybody loves a table. People have asked me for tables all the time. So here is a little bit of a table with some timestamps and ages. You can take a picture of this if you want. These are total generalizations, right? Don't, shriek and say, my kid's 11, they can't do this, right? These are general things. But at 3 to 5, we want our kids to start have some bursts of attention, right? Sustained attention, some emerging impulse control. That looks like waiting their turn, but also definitely needing a lot of structure and reminders. 6 to 8, we want our kids to start to be able to follow 2 or 3 step directions, have some basic self-regulation skills, recognize emotions, but also still definitely get frustrated and distracted. Totally fine. 9 to 11, we want our kids to start having some type of longer term planning. If you have kids in this 8 to 11 range, I would really encourage you guys to spend 10 or 15 minutes with them every Sunday night just looking at the week ahead. Just get in the habit of looking what their week looks like. So they say, okay, I got practice on Thursday, right? Or I have a test on Friday, right? We want our kids to start to think ahead of what these things might look like. 11 to 13, we want our kids to start to become a little more flexible, going with the flow, emotional regulation. Maybe they can balance a couple tasks at the same time or kind of pivot their attention between them. But we also totally expect some mood fluctuation and motivation, lots of times because this is the onset of puberty. 14 to 18, we start to get some things that we want our teens to do about abstract thinking, longer term planning. Totally unreasonable expectation for our kids to decide about their whole future at 7 or 18 for college, but society sucks that way. That's the way it's totally inappropriate though from a psychological perspective. But we want our kids to set goals and prioritize short-term rewards and longer-term rewards too. And then 18, 25, we want some of these networks to mature. We want some consistent follow-through, some independence. Okay, let's talk about screens. Obviously, you guys are all here to learn about screens. If you feel comfortable raising your hand, I mean, if you think about your kid, think about like, are screens a problem in your home? Raise your hand if you feel like they're a problem in your home. Yeah, a lot of you. Okay, some not so much. That's okay too. I would love to hear from you guys towards the end about what works. I'm going to share what works for me in my practice. I'm going to talk to you about what the science says. Not all screen time is equal. We're going to talk about what good screen time, what's lower risk, things like that. Okay. I really do see screens as this weird digital playground. It can be a lot of fun, but it totally needs supervision, especially for young kids. There's obvious benefits to supervision. And this is not a talk where I'm sitting here telling you, you must take away screens from your kids. That is not the path forward. The path forward here is to work with screens alongside what's appropriate for your kid's own development and biology. If your approach as a parent is to just completely have your kids abstain from screen use, I think that might be a problem longer term. So we want our kids to engage intentionally with screens. We're going to talk about what that means. So on average, children ages 8 to 12 spend over 5 hours a day on screens, okay? If you have an iPhone, I get all these screen time. Every Sunday, I get a screen time notification about you've spent entirely too much time on the phone, and it makes me feel bad every week. So our kids spend even more than at least what I spend. That's a little scary to think about, just in terms of what we know about screen time. Not all screen time is created equal. It's just like a diet. Piece of candy here or there, totally fine for our kids. Great rewards. Too much is really overstimulating, interferes, especially chronic use, interferes with focus. Lots of times I work with some very young kids in my practice, 4 to 6, and I'm advising parents. And they say, my child has a problem sustaining their focus, right? They seem very unfocused, sometimes even as old as 7 and 8. I ask about screen time. Well, they're on it for 3 or 4 hours a day, and at school too. Well, that to me probably means your kid doesn't have like this inherent attentional problem. your kid's brain is just conditioned to constant digital input, and they have no tolerance to build any type of sustained attention ability. It's like a muscle you have to get in the gym and build. Now, attention with these apps and screen time in general, Facebook, TikTok, right? There is a reason why there is no pause between an autoplay video on Facebook, right? I'm on Facebook and I'm watching these reels and it's just constant input. I get no pause. So it's optimized for novelty, right? There's a reason why Meta and Facebook and Instagram, that's all Meta, TikTok, right? They employ psychologists like me to get your kids' attention. That's not, that's by design, guys. That they pay these people a lot of money to make sure that social media is addicting for adults and particularly kids. So over time, our kids' brains become wired to seek this really fast, easy rewards over slow, effortful ones. That's where I see a lot of behavioral issues come in with kids in my practice. Growing up with screens, I heard that I've read this a couple times, like giving your kid a Ferrari engine with bicycle brakes, right? That's how their brain is working. I think it's also important to note too that screen time is a really unique thing in this particular day and age. So I'm looking around and I'm assuming that a lot of you guys as parents, you don't have an internal schema to draw from about how your parents manage screen time with you. Okay, so lots of times as a parent, you're kind of thinking, well, my mom did this and that was awful, so I'm not going to do that with my kid, right? Or they did this really well, right? And I want to do that. A lot of us have no type of an internal experience to draw from with screen time, and we're kind of poking in the dark a little bit. And that's okay, but it makes things a lot more challenging. So lots of times, kids that are looking bored or unmotivated, right, might be what I said a moment ago. Their attentional systems are just conditioned to seek really high stimulation, and they're not really that cool or tolerant of slow dopamine activities, and so naturally we opt out of them. A general rule around screen time is that screen time for our kids and adults too, but we're talking about kids, should have some intention, okay? So if you're noticing even with yourself that you're just kind of mindlessly getting on your phone because you're bored or you're in line, right? There's no intention behind that. That's not good screen time use. Same thing goes with your kid. So if your kid is just on screen time as kind of a stopgap measure between tasks, find a different task. Got to get your kid away from that. Okay, screen time is not one thing, all right? So there's some screen time that as a psychologist, I have no problem with for our kids, and it's actually protective, and some is very low risk. Educational stuff, totally fine. I mean, in moderation, right? I don't want kids staring at a math game for 8 hours, right? But it's totally protective. Your kid wants to do some research, going to go on Wikipedia or whatever, look at, interesting things at, historical events, whatever, writing, learning apps, language apps, right? Totally fine. I have no problem at all. Co-viewing, like at home, watching a movie together, documentary, totally fine with that too. Pretty protective. Now, creation type stuff like coding and digital art and music production, I see this a lot in teens that I work with, also not really that big of a risk, right? As long as it's in moderation. I endorse kids and teens getting on and doing those things. Now, passive consumption, endless scrolling, autoplay videos, killing time, no intention behind the screen time, just doing it because this is what I normally do at 8 p.m., right? Like that is very high risk screen time, especially for our kids. That's the stuff that worries me as a psychologist for these kids in their developing brains. Okay, how does screen time interfere with executive functioning skill development? Executive functioning skills grow through real world problem solving. So what I said earlier about being bored, right? Waiting in line, managing boredom, navigating disagreements, planning how to spend my time. When these devices fill every pause, every sense of discomfort, every boredom moment, right? Our kids get such fewer reps to build these great skills that we want them to have. And so when we start to think about maybe why can't my kid do that, right? Why does my kid need like constant attention, right? It's maybe because we haven't instilled in them the skill to be bored and to figure it out what's going, how do I busy myself, right? How do I become a little more self-sufficient? So the brain needs practice tolerating those small doses of frustration to end up building resilience, okay? So again, if you take anything from this, please have your kid be a little bored, okay? Have your kid be bored. Help them figure out what to do with their time, obviously with some support and whatnot, but don't fill it with a screen. All right, let's talk about sleep for a second. Okay, if you've worked with me, you know that I constantly ask about sleep. Sleep is undervalued, I think, generally speaking, in child development. If there's a lot of research, even if your kid has chronically very mild sleep problems, right? Instead of getting, if you have an 8-year-old, instead of getting like 9 to 10, they get like 6 to 7 over the course of a couple weeks. That's really not cool for them. Okay, that I would expect them to have some behavioral, attentional, and emotional issues because of that. Young kids are very sensitive to chronically lack of sleep. Blue light exposure is kind of a trickster, keeps the Sandman away. So the brain's interpretation of blue light staring at a screen is daylight. Okay, so it's practically just as good as being outside in the sun. And it's not just the light. I hear this kind of half argument all the time. People say blue light exposure, blue light exposure. It's the content too. What I mean by that is lots of times parents will say, my kid really likes to watch a TV show before bedtime. It helps them wind down. All right, that's cool. But in terms of your brain, I can tell you that there's a lot of activation going on in their brain. So they may be having like a behavioral kind of routine that helps them say, okay, TV associated with sleep. But what I'm telling you, neurobiologically, is that show is actually keeping their brain up. Okay, so replace screen time, replace these TV shows around bedtime with other positive things. Do some mindfulness-based exercises. Have a conversation. Do some reading. Things are going to help their brain start to slow down. The downstream effects of this are harder times focusing, difficulty inhibiting our impulses, memory-based issues, and certainly things like managing moods and strong feelings. Poor sleep weakens our brain CEO, right? Our prefrontal cortex. Constantly the one more thing effect too. If bedtime, and I hear this constantly, bedtime is a push and pull, a tug. I don't want to go to bed, or I'm going to miss out, right? Or you and dad are staying up, right? Why do you get to stay up? I don't get to stay up, right? All of this, if we get into the kind of this, again, negotiation or this resistance around bedtime, it's basically saying that, okay, when it's time to go to bed, our kids start to learn that this is negotiation time, right? And so that's not helping their brain turn off either. Now, relatedly, if we're having our kids use screens or any type of screen interaction at all between bedtime, around bedtime, these platforms have no natural stopping cue. I've yet to be on Facebook or anything where a screen comes up and says, you've been on me for 2 hours, you should get off me, that's not good for you, right? It doesn't tell you that because they want you to be engaged. They want you to have this constant input. It's purposeful on their end. There's no natural cue to say, get off me, right? Consistent finding, it's not even really disputed, right? If you look at the sleep medicine research in pediatric type journals, you see kids who use screen directly prior to bedtime, not only do they sleep less, but the quality of their sleep plummets, okay? They sleep less and they sleep way worse. Okay, let's talk practical strategies for a second. How do we build some more adaptive brains, help our kids build good habits? So routine, structure, it's critical. And the good news is that as parents and caregivers, we have a lot of control over our kids' structure and routine. The bad news is, man, that requires a lot of work from us, right? And so kind of a double-edged sword. So as much as you can make predictable the routines around homework, when our kids are doing it, right? What proximity after school are they doing it? Bedtime, morning routines, right? If you look at how to really optimize your kids' sleep, you really should have your kid wake up and go to bed at the same time. This idea of weekdays and weekends, I get to stay up late on weekends, not great, right? As much as you can make it consistent, the better. Visual reminders. If you've worked with me, I often recommend that if your kid really benefits from visual calendars, seeing the week ahead, to-do lists, collaborate with your kids on these things. Make it collaborative and say, we're going to, hey, you really suck at your morning routine, right? You require constant reminders to brush your hair and then brush your teeth and then put your clothes on, right? Okay, well then let's build in a little bit of a visual checklist around in the morning. And then, hey, if you do this 2 days in a row, you get a surprise or you get some type of reward. That's for younger kids, obviously. If your teenager's not getting dressed for school, that's a different problem. Now, breaking down tasks into smaller steps. So what I mentioned earlier about celebrating progress, not just completion. Please, 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 I urge you guys to focus and reinforce this idea of you've worked very hard on this, right? I appreciate how hard you've worked. I appreciate all the time that you put towards that. Not just saying, you got that done, great job. We want to reinforce the process of it. Coaching and planning organization is also big. Ask kids about their plan to get things done, especially teens, rather than did you do this or did you do that, right? Lots of times I work with teens and they say, my parent is just on me all the time. Did I do this? Did I do that? Yada, yada. I don't hear a whole lot of parents asking their kids, hey, what's your plan to get that done, right? So simple reframe around language. Emotionally, we want to validate our kids' emotions, particularly younger kids, before they problem solve. You're frustrated. That makes sense to me, right? We talked about the primal brain, we talked about being emotionally flooded earlier. The prefrontal cortex goes totally offline, not really trying to reason with our kids when they're upset. It's just that we need to help them de-escalate, co-regulate, not necessarily trying to instill a lot of logic in them. Practice and prompting pause moments, stop breathing and thinking, right? Just helping kids take a beat. Praising effortful self-control, right? So if you have young kids who struggle with impulsivity, right, you want to reinforce the process of you waited your turn. That was great, right? Even when these things are very small. And kids borrow you guys as regulation as parents, right? They look to you about how to respond to stress and boredom when they're upset, right? They're looking to see how you and dad and mom interact with each other, right? They want to see that. As much as you can model and even process with your kid in a developmentally appropriate way to help them build good habits, to manage their emotions, all the better, right? Talk to your young kid. If you have young kids, talk to them about, oh, I had a horrible day at work, and here's what I'm doing to try to make myself feel better, right? I ate a good meal, or I took a second, right? Talk to your kids about those things. They understand more than we think they comprehend. Okay, tech habits. I get a lot of pushback from parents in a lot of these because I think a lot of these feel like such a heavy lift. All right. We've talked about slow dopamine. We want to encourage slow dopamine. We want to not encourage fast dopamine. Schedule screen-free zones, right? I have never in my life gotten more pushback, the laser doesn't work, about car rides. I've given this talk across different states and schools, and parents say, I can't give my kid an iPad on a car ride? What am I supposed to do with him, right? Like, what do I do? And my answer is, well, I guess you have to talk to them, right? So, and I have had this feedback, particularly from older parents who have teens and young adults now. They say, as a teenager, as a mom or a dad of a teenager, right? My kid disclosed more personal things on car rides than in any other setting, right? And I think about that as a psychologist through a couple different ways. It's not like my mom came to me and says, how was your first date last night, right? It wasn't like that. We're just chatting, right? The interpersonal demands, I don't even have to look at my mom in the eye, right? We can just sit side by side. We're both doing something, right? Talk to your kids in the car. Debrief about the day. Talk about what was great. Do some highs and lows, right? Talk to them. And I'm not saying if you have an 8-hour car ride across the state or whatever, right, you can't give them an iPad for some of that. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is these short bursts of, hey, maybe we got 20 minutes from here to home, right? Maybe that 20 minutes is repurposed. Instead of screens, maybe they just talk. You debrief about the day. Replace scroll time with co-use, and use some timers for free use, right? So if your kid wants some free use of screen time, they'll play a game, right? I'm not even against that. But it needs to be moderated, and it needs to have a natural warning of an end, right? Nothing like, oh, you get to be on screens until it's bedtime. No. You get 15 minutes, and here's the timer, okay? Help kids notice how screens make them feel. Constant observation when I talk with kids and parents is that, especially around teens, I have had parents say to me numerous times, boy, we took away video games for 3 weeks, and oh my God, my kid became great, right? Like I get that constantly. But then we gave it back because they met all their obligations. Okay, well, maybe then video games just shouldn't be a part of the picture, right? As challenging as that is. But help kids talk through how screens make them feel. I know as an adult, I feel like garbage after I've been on a screen all day. I don't have anybody to talk to about it, but like I know in general that it makes me feel bad. Help your kids make the connection. In terms of modeling, you want to narrate your own habits, right? So let's say you guys are at dinner and you hear your phone chime and you're like, oh, I'm expecting a text or whatever. Talk about it. That text, right? I'm tempted to text that, but it's our family rule that no screens during dinner, right? So I'm not going to check that. Keep devices out of your bedrooms, obviously for kids, but I would encourage you guys as adults too, unless of course, you're a physician, you're on call, right? That's totally different. That's an extenuating circumstance, but keep your devices out of your bedroom. And sometimes I'll hear parents say, my phone charges on my nightstand, right? You're still exposed though to chimes and vibrates. Even if your phone is on Do Not Disturb, you're still exposed to all that. So use family-wide tech rules and follow them and model them, particularly as we're talking about you guys as adults. Have some basic tech rules, 2 or 3 rules. We don't use screens at dinner, right? We don't use screens in the car for under 30-minute drives, right? I don't know, whatever you want it to be. And then have some boundaries around health and focus. Make screens boundaries about health and focus, not punishment, right? Help them make the connection to the box just to the left of that. Talk to your kids. Hey, Jane, I notice your behavior, you have a hard time the next day when you're on screens from 8 to 9, right? Okay, well, make it about like taking away the screen. Hey, I'm trying to set you up to be your best self tomorrow, right? That's an important type of association for our kids. Okay, sleep. Then we're going to wrap it up. All right, tech curfews really shouldn't have screen time in any proximity to bedtime, especially for young kids. But if you can get it down to 60 minutes, that's great. If you can get it more, that's even better. Have device-free bedrooms. We talked about this. Charge your phones collectively in the kitchen or something. I mean, have them all set there. Don't put them in your room. Have a consistent wind-down routine. Maybe you want some reading, some quiet music. Maybe you have an athlete at home and you want to do some like mutual stretching, and they can show you how flexible you are, and you can show them how crusty and old you've gotten. I don't know. Do some journaling, some family activity, something, and do some family modeling about show your kids how you should be interacting with your screens at home in the same way you want your kids to interact too, as challenging as that may be. And so the language I just talked about, we're protecting tomorrow's energy and focus, right? I want you to be your best self. You got a test tomorrow, right? We need to have you tip-top shape. Okay, key takeaways, a couple different things here. I'm not going to rehash them totally. You can read, but generally speaking, if you're taking a few things away, I hope it's some practical strategies, but I also hope too that it's this big theme of your kid's brain gets really good at what it practices, okay? So if it's practicing very poor habits, those habits are then going to be easier for your kid to get into, right? Talk about the myelination, the pruning, right? Your brain gets good at what it practices. The better we can make our kids, the better habits we can get them, the easier those habits are going to be for longer term use, okay? All right, there are so many resources out there, flooded with resources constantly. It's hard to know what's based on real evidence or what was just some blog post about somebody's kid, right? Like it's hard to know. So I would encourage you guys, if you have questions, you're always free to email me about, is this a good resource? Here are 3 resources that I really do trust. American Academy of Pediatrics. Common Sense Media is really good. And then anything out of Harvard is pretty ironclad. Some of you I know have read some books on the right, mainly because I've recommended them to you if you've worked with me, but some of you may have read them too. The Anxious Generation was a New York Times bestseller. It kind of is a great jumping off point for this entire talk, but The Whole Brain Child is great. Smart But Scattered, if you have a kid who struggles with executive functions, Smart But Scattered is a great place to start for actual tangible skills at home, okay? Like a kind of a how-to guide about how to increase some structure and things at home, all right? All right, that was a crash course, guys. A lot of information. What questions do you have? If you want to ask me things later, that's great too.